A little boy finds a crying millionaire at his mother's grave. What he says leaves him in shock. The cemetery was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of wind pushing through brittle leaves. Richard Hayes stood still under the heavy gray sky, his tailored coat flapping softly at his sides. 3 years had passed since he buried Emma. 3 years of silence, of pretending. He knelt slowly in front of her gravestone, fingers tightening around the edge of a small bouquet. The white roses were already beginning to droop, like his posture, like his will. This visit was never meant for show. There were no cameras, no press releases, just grief, raw and lonely. He placed the flowers on the stone and let his hand rest against her name. Emma Hayes, beloved wife, taken too soon. His throat tightened. "I should have come last year," he whispered. "I should have." A small voice broke through the stillness behind him. "Are you crying for her too? She was my mommy." Richard turned, startled. A boy stood a few steps away, no older than 6, bundled in a too-big denim jacket with frayed sleeves. His hair was messy and dark, his hands clutching a single red carnation. But what struck Richard wasn't the boy's words. It was his eyes, green, flecked with gold. Emma's eyes. Richard's world swayed. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice unsteady. The boy looked at him, tilting his head. "My mommy's name was Emma Hayes. She's right here." He pointed toward the gravestone, not realizing the chaos those words unleashed. "That's impossible," Richard murmured, almost to himself. The boy took a step closer. "She used to visit me sometimes, at the house, but she stopped coming." He lowered his voice, eyes flicking down. "Miss Sarah at the shelter said she's in heaven now." Richard's mind raced. This had to be a mistake, a coincidence, someone playing a cruel trick. But the more he looked, the less sure he became. "What's your name?" Richard asked carefully. "Caleb," the boy replied. "Caleb Monroe." Richard blinked. That name. Emma's maiden name was Monroe. The earth beneath him seemed to shift. Everything, his routine, his grief, his understanding of the past 3 years, began to crack. "Do you know how old you are?" Richard asked, his voice tightening. 6, Caleb said proudly. "Almost 7. 6. That meant Emma would have been pregnant shortly before the accident. Before her death. Before everything fell apart. Richard stood abruptly. The boy flinched, just slightly. "I'm not going to hurt you," Richard said, more to himself than to the boy. "I just need to think." Caleb lowered the carnation to the grave, placing it gently on the stone beside the roses. "I never met my daddy," he said softly. "But I think Mommy still loved him. She said she just needed to keep me safe." Richard couldn't breathe. For years he'd drowned himself in work, building tech empires, brokering deals, earning Forbes covers, all while pushing Emma's memory into the quiet corners of his mind. They had tried to have children, tried and failed. And after a while, they had stopped talking about it altogether. They had fought, yes, drifted even. But this? A son? "Who brings you here?" Richard asked, his voice rasping. Caleb shrugged. "I took the bus. Miss Sarah gave me the flower and $1. She said Mommy would like it." Richard stared at the boy. His eyes, his mouth, his posture. Emma's echo in every line. Something inside him cracked. Not just pain, not just shock, hope. "I think," Richard said slowly, "we need to talk to Miss Sarah." Caleb nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "Okay, you're nice. Most people don't talk to me at the cemetery." Richard almost laughed, almost, but what escaped was closer to a broken breath. As they walked toward the gate together, Richard glanced down at Caleb. There were still questions, 1,000 of them. But for now he had only one that mattered. What if this little boy was his? The shelter was tucked between a laundromat and an old church in the Bronx. It wasn't much: cracked bricks, flickering signage, and a door that groaned with age. But it was clean. Safe. And it was Caleb's home. Richard hesitated before stepping inside. His shoes felt too expensive for the stained tile floor. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as a handful of children ran past with cardboard toys and mismatched socks. Caleb led the way with a strange kind of pride, like he belonged here, like he wasn't a walking miracle that had just toppled the foundation of Richard's world. A woman with tired eyes and a warm smile approached them. "Mr. Hayes?" she asked cautiously. "I'm Sarah Duncan. Caleb said you were coming." She extended a hand, and Richard shook it, too stunned to do much else. "Miss Duncan," he said, trying to find the right tone. "He told me he thinks his mother was Emma Hayes." Sarah's expression shifted from polite to guarded in an instant. "He told me the same. He's been saying it for years. And no one thought to contact me?" Sarah folded her arms gently, like someone used to being blamed for things far outside her control. "Mr. Hayes, Emma never put your name on any paperwork. As far as we knew, Caleb's father was out of the picture. Emma would show up sometimes with toys, money, and envelopes. She loved that boy, but she kept her distance." Richard swallowed. "Why?" "She once told me," Sarah said, voice low, "that her world was full of people who made decisions for her, that Caleb needed one person who didn't. That sounded like Emma. Fierce, independent, mysterious when it hurt the most. Do you have anything she left behind?" he asked. Sarah walked toward the back office. "Wait here." A few minutes later, she returned with a cardboard box. Inside were scraps of a life. A faded picture of Emma holding an infant wrapped in a hospital blanket. A small music box. Several handwritten letters. Richard lifted one, heart thundering. "Caleb, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone." He stopped. Closed his eyes. "Is it him?" Caleb asked softly, standing by the door, his small fingers wrapped around the frame. Richard opened his eyes and looked at him. "What do you mean?" "The man Mommy loved," Caleb whispered. "Is it you?" Richard knelt slowly so they were eye level. "I don't know yet, but I want to find out." That night, Richard didn't go back to his penthouse overlooking Central Park. Instead, he stayed in a modest hotel near the shelter, unable to sleep. The box sat on the table in front of him, a portal to a past he'd never known existed. He read every letter, every note. Emma had written about their arguments, about her fear of losing Caleb, about her guilt, and yet the tone of her letters never turned bitter. She had shielded Caleb from pain, even from Richard. The next day, Richard made arrangements for a DNA test. While they waited, he spent his mornings at the shelter, reading to the kids, playing cards, awkwardly trying to help with meals. He was comically bad at making PB&Js and had no idea how to braid hair, but they laughed with him anyway. Especially Caleb. They sat on the floor together one afternoon, building towers out of mismatched blocks. Caleb looked up at him with a sudden seriousness. "Do you miss her a lot?" Richard nodded. "Every day." Caleb looked down. "Me too. But it's better when I talk to you." Richard didn't respond. He couldn't. His throat was too tight. He realized then that the boy didn't just remind him of Emma. He reminded him of himself. And for the first time in years, Richard didn't feel quite so alone. Richard Hayes had built billion-dollar companies from scratch, faced shareholders during market crashes, and negotiated hostile takeovers without flinching. But nothing compared to the helplessness he felt waiting for that DNA test result. It wasn't just about biology anymore. It was about responsibility, about truth, about healing. But healing required confronting everything he'd buried, and some things refused to stay in the past. Late one evening, Richard received an email from a former business associate. Miles Landon. The subject line read, "We need to talk about Emma." He hadn't spoken to Miles in nearly 5 years, not since the fallout over a failed investment. They were never close, but the name struck a nerve. Miles and Emma had been friends before the divorce rumors, before the accident. Richard clicked open the message. "There's something you don't know about Emma. I should have told you years ago. I'm sorry." Attached was a photo, a grainy, time-stamped security image from 7 years prior. Emma stood outside a clinic, pregnant, alone. The timestamp was exactly 3 weeks after their last major fight, the one where she packed a bag and left without a word. Richard's hands trembled. The implication was clear. She had known she was pregnant, and she chose not to tell him. A wave of betrayal crashed over him, heavier than any he'd felt at the gravesite. He closed the laptop and paced the room. His thoughts spiraled. Why did she hide it? Why didn't she trust him? Had he pushed her so far away that she believed he wasn't capable of loving a child? The next morning, his mood followed him to the shelter. Caleb noticed instantly. "Did something bad happen?" "No," Richard lied. Then added, "Just a long night." Caleb nodded, but something in his face dimmed. Miss Sarah pulled Richard aside. "He's very perceptive. Kids like Caleb, kids who've lived through abandonment, they read people better than we do." "I'm not abandoning him," Richard said too quickly. "I didn't say you were," Sarah replied gently. "But you're angry at someone. And he's picking it up." That hit like a slap. He tried to shake it off, but the feeling lingered. That afternoon, he visited Emma's old friend Julia, a pediatric nurse who'd been close to her during the final year. She looked surprised to see him. "Richard, wow. I didn't expect—" "I need to ask you something," he said without preamble. "Did Emma ever tell you why she kept Caleb from me?" Julia looked away. "She was scared," she said softly. "You were working nonstop, traveling, barely home. She felt like she'd already lost you." "I never would have left her," Richard said, almost defensively. "She didn't think you'd leave. She thought you'd demand control, that you'd try to fix things your way. And she just wanted to do it her way. For once." He closed his eyes, feeling like he was looking at an old wound that never healed right. Back at the shelter, Caleb was in the reading room, curled up on a beanbag chair, thumbing through a book about airplanes. Richard sat beside him. "Hey," he said. "Mind if I join you?" Caleb looked up and smiled faintly. "You can read the voices. You're good at that." Richard smiled, but inside he was unraveling. "I wanted to ask you something," he said, once they reached the last page. "Okay. If you ever wanted to live somewhere else, like in a house, with just me, how would that make you feel?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He stared at the drawing of a plane taking off, then looked up. "I'd miss Miss Sarah. And the kids. But I'd like that. I'd like a dad." Richard's voice cracked. "Yeah? You think I'd be any good?" "You already are," Caleb said simply. "Even when you're sad." That night, the DNA results came in. Richard didn't open the envelope. He held it in his hands for hours, sitting by the window of his hotel room, the city buzzing far below. But in the morning, he made his decision. He walked into the shelter, envelope still sealed, and said, "I'd like to begin adoption paperwork." Sarah blinked. "You haven't opened the results." "I don't need to." And he meant it. The adoption process, even with Richard's resources, was not immediate. The shelter worked with strict state policies, and the system didn't care about bank accounts. It cared about background checks, home visits, and psychological evaluations. Still, Richard welcomed the structure. For once, he wasn't trying to bypass the rules. He was living within them. Because Caleb deserved real effort, not a shortcut. Meanwhile, the media began to circle. It started with a blurry photo. Richard Hayes exiting a shelter hand in hand with a young boy. Then came the headlines. Tech billionaire adopting child from shelter? Richard Hayes seen with mysterious child. Secret son? The press had a field day. Sarah called him into her office one morning holding her phone like it was a live grenade. "This attention isn't good for Caleb," she said, firm but not unkind. "Paparazzi have been circling the block. One tried to talk to him in the parking lot yesterday." Richard's jaw clenched. "I'll increase security." "That's not the point," she replied. "He needs stability, not to become someone's headline." Richard paused. "I'll handle it. I promise." But damage had already been done. One of the older boys at the shelter made a cruel comment during lunch. "Guess you don't need us anymore, 'cause your new dad's a billionaire." Caleb stayed quiet, but Richard noticed him picking at his food and not touching his dessert. Later, Richard found him sitting alone in the library corner, hugging his knees. "You okay?" he asked, kneeling beside him. Caleb shrugged. "They think I'm just lucky." "Well, you kind of are," Richard joked gently, nudging him with his shoulder. Caleb gave a tiny smile, but it faded quickly. "But what if they're right? What if you just picked me 'cause you felt sorry for me?" Richard sat down fully on the floor, legs crossed. "I didn't pick you because I felt sorry for you," he said. "I picked you because every time I look at you I see someone brave, kind. And because I don't feel like I'm fixing your life, I feel like you're fixing mine." Caleb leaned into him. "I just don't want you to leave." "I won't," Richard said. "No matter what happens, that's a promise." That night, Richard called his PR team. Not to bury the story, but to take control of it. The next morning, he gave a press statement. "Yes, I've begun the process to adopt a boy named Caleb. This decision wasn't about publicity or charity. It's personal. I ask for privacy as we navigate this transition together." It was short, clear, and sincere. The frenzy eased, slightly. Back at the shelter, a new complexity emerged. An elderly woman arrived one afternoon, asking to speak with Sarah. She introduced herself as Margaret Monroe, Emma's estranged aunt. "I saw the news," she said. "I didn't even know Emma had a child. But I'm still her family." Richard and Sarah listened cautiously. Margaret wasn't demanding custody. She wasn't challenging the adoption, but she was asking for something more delicate, a relationship. "I live in upstate New York, quiet little place. I just thought, maybe Caleb should know someone who knew his mother, who loved her too, even if she shut me out." Richard watched her closely. Her hands trembled, but her voice didn't. He asked Caleb privately later that night, "Would you like to meet someone who knew your mom? A relative?" Caleb blinked. "You mean like family?" Richard nodded. Caleb thought for a while. "Only if you come with me." And so they did. The weekend trip to Margaret's small cottage became something none of them expected. Healing. She showed Caleb photo albums, little keepsakes, and even an old sweater of Emma's she'd saved for years. Richard stood in the background for most of it, letting the boy explore his history. But at one point, Margaret took his hand and said, "Thank you for giving him something none of us could." He didn't reply, just nodded, overwhelmed. The adoption was nearly complete. Just one more court date stood between Richard and permanent guardianship of Caleb. But fate rarely allows closure without one final blow. It started with a phone call. Richard was at his office, reviewing expansion plans for his company's AI division, when his assistant buzzed in. "There's a woman here asking to speak with you. She says her name is Natalie Green. She claims to know something about your son." Richard stiffened. He hadn't heard that name in years. "Natalie Green," he repeated. "Yes, sir. Should I send her in?" He hesitated, then said, "Yes." Natalie walked in confidently, a woman in her late 30s with carefully styled blonde hair and an expensive coat. Her presence alone made it clear she wasn't here for charity. "It's been a long time, Richard," she said, sitting before he offered. "I didn't come to dredge up the past, but I need to talk to you about Caleb." "Well, what about him?" She leaned forward, placing a manila folder on his desk. "I used to work with Emma, years ago. We were both teaching assistants at Columbia. She trusted me." Richard stayed quiet. "She was terrified when she got pregnant," Natalie said. "Felt trapped between your world and the life she thought she had lost." "She never told me," he said bitterly. "She didn't plan to keep the baby at first, but I talked her out of terminating. I helped her find the shelter. She wanted to be close, but invisible." Natalie slid the folder closer. "I have proof. Journal entries, messages. She was scared of you, Richard." He looked up sharply. "I never hurt her." "I know," Natalie said. "But she didn't trust you to let her raise Caleb the way she wanted. Without pressure, without expectations." He opened the folder and skimmed the pages. Emma's handwriting, unmistakable. Raw, fearful, emotional. He'll want to mold the baby into his image. "I love Richard. But I don't want Caleb to be a trophy or a legacy. I just want him to be free." Richard read the words over and over. Natalie stood. "I'm not here to accuse you. I just needed you to understand the weight she carried. If you truly care about Caleb, let him grow without turning him into another version of you." She left. Richard sat in silence, the words sinking like stones in water. That evening he skipped his board meeting and went straight to the shelter. Caleb was sitting on the floor, surrounded by Lego bricks, trying to build a helicopter. When he saw Richard, he smiled. "Hey, you came early." Richard sat beside him. "I needed to see you," he said. "Needed to remind myself what really matters." Caleb paused. "Did something happen?" Richard ruffled his hair. "A lot happened. But you're the one thing that makes sense right now." They sat together, building in silence, until Caleb leaned into him and whispered, "I wish Mommy could see us." Richard swallowed hard. "I think she can." Later that night, Richard stood in his penthouse living room, staring out over the Manhattan skyline. The lights below glittered like stars, but they felt cold, distant. He walked to a cabinet he hadn't opened in years and pulled out a sealed box. Inside were mementos, old photos of him and Emma, concert tickets, letters. At the bottom was a small velvet box containing the necklace he had given her on their anniversary, the same week they'd fought and she'd left. He stared at it a long time before placing it on the table. He called Sarah the next morning. "I want to delay the court date." She paused. "May I ask why?" "I need time," he said. "Not to change my mind, but to change myself." He began spending full days at the shelter, volunteering, listening, learning. He even brought in therapists and tutors for the kids, not just Caleb. Slowly, the shelter evolved into something better. Not a project, but a purpose. When the new court date arrived 3 months later, Richard wore no suit. Just a sweater and jeans. Caleb wore the same. The judge, surprised by the casual appearance, asked, "Mr. Hayes, do you still intend to go through with the adoption?" "I do," Richard said. "But not as Richard Hayes, the billionaire." He looked at Caleb. "I want to be his dad, the kind that shows up, listens, and lets him grow into whoever he's meant to be." The judge nodded slowly. "In that case, welcome to fatherhood." Caleb jumped into his arms, laughing. "We did it!" Richard held him close, smiling through tears. The turning point wasn't the paperwork. It was understanding what kind of father he truly wanted to be, and who Caleb had already helped him become. Life after the courtroom moment was not instantly perfect, but it was real. And for Richard Hayes, that meant everything. The first few weeks of living together were filled with small, quiet discoveries. Caleb liked apples, but not the skin. He hated sleeping with the door closed. He always needed 2 bedtime stories, one read and one told from memory. Preferably something with airplanes. Richard adjusted. He learned how to cook breakfast. Burnt eggs at first, then gradually passable. He scheduled meetings later in the day so he could walk Caleb to school. He even started reading parenting blogs at night, laughing at how foreign but necessary it all felt. Still, some moments cut deep. One afternoon, while organizing boxes of Caleb's things in his new bedroom, Richard found a drawing. A stick figure version of Emma holding hands with a small boy. There was no father in the picture. He stared at it for a long time. Caleb came in quietly. "That's my old drawing, from before I met you." Richard nodded. "It's beautiful." "I didn't think I had a dad back then," Caleb said. "I used to ask Mommy about him, but she'd just say, 'Someday.'" Richard swallowed. "Do you still think about her a lot?" Caleb nodded. "All the time." "Do you want to talk about her more? Or maybe we can start a memory box?" Caleb's face lit up. "Like with stories and pictures?" "Exactly." It became their evening ritual. Each night, after brushing teeth and folding laundry, they'd sit and write down memories, or dreams, or even silly guesses about Emma. Things like, "Mommy used to smell like vanilla," or "I think she liked rainy days," or "She would have laughed at this joke." For Richard, it wasn't just bonding. It was healing. He was rediscovering Emma through Caleb's eyes. Softer eyes. Forgiving ones. Still, challenges crept in. Richard's board of directors grew restless with his reduced presence at work. His name no longer filled tech news cycles. Investors asked pointed questions. At one meeting, his CFO said, "Are we to assume your priorities have shifted permanently?" Richard looked around the table and said simply, "Yes." The room fell silent. Then he added, "But that doesn't mean the company has to suffer. It means I'm finally leading with the right kind of urgency." It wasn't the response they expected, but it was one they respected. At home, Caleb had his own challenges. He was shy at his new school, often withdrawing during recess or refusing to talk during group activities. His teacher, Ms. Alvarez, called Richard in for a parent meeting. "He's bright," she said, "but cautious, like he's waiting for the world to change again." Richard nodded. "It did, more than once." Ms. Alvarez smiled. "It might help if you could visit. Maybe read a book to the class? Let them see the man behind the myth." So he did. The next week, Richard showed up with The Little Prince and a bag of paper crowns for all the kids. He read with warmth, with pauses, with questions. And when he looked up, Caleb was beaming. That night, Caleb asked if they could make paper crowns at home. "Only if I get to wear one too," Richard joked. The two of them wore them through dinner. Life wasn't flawless, it was real, and full of echoes, of Emma's love, of missed chances, of second beginnings. And though Richard had once ruled over empires of code and contracts, his greatest investment had become something quieter. A life rebuilt from memory, connection, and a little boy who refused to be forgotten. Winter in New York arrived like a hush over the city. Gentle snowfalls, holiday lights, and 1,000 moments waiting to be remembered. For Richard and Caleb, it marked their first full season together as father and son. But growth doesn't come wrapped in comfort. It comes quietly, through challenge. Richard had enrolled Caleb in a Saturday morning art class after noticing how often he drew in silence at home. Caleb was hesitant at first, unsure about being with kids he didn't know. But by the third week, he started bringing home canvases full of color and shape. One Saturday, Richard arrived early to pick him up, and found Caleb standing alone near the corner of the room, not painting, just staring at a blank canvas. "Everything okay?" Richard asked. Caleb shrugged. I wanted to draw Mommy, but I can't remember her face exactly anymore. Richard crouched beside him. That's okay. But what if I forget her? Caleb whispered. You won't, Richard said softly. Not as long as you keep telling stories. Memories live longer when we share them. That night, instead of bedtime stories, they sat at the kitchen counter and started drawing together. Richard wasn't much of an artist. His sketch of Emma looked like a cartoon with bad hair. But it made Caleb laugh. And that was the point. Over time, the boy who once tiptoed through life began to stretch his voice. He spoke up in class. He joined a small soccer league. He invited a friend over for the first time. And Richard, in his own way, transformed with him. He started letting go of control, the need to fix, to perfect. He learned how to just be. How to burn waffles on a Sunday morning and laugh about it, instead of cursing under his breath. How to cry during a children's movie and not hide it. How to listen to silence without needing to fill it. Still, not every day was easy. There were nights when Caleb had nightmares, sometimes about being left, sometimes about nothing he could name. On one such night, Richard woke to soft footsteps and found Caleb standing in the doorway of his bedroom, clutching a blanket. I had a dream, he whispered. You weren't there anymore. Richard moved over, lifted the blanket, and said, I'm here. Caleb climbed in beside him, curling close. Do you promise? The boy asked. I promise. In the morning, Caleb was back to normal, laughing over cereal, asking if penguins had knees. But for Richard, the moment lingered. Not because it frightened him, but because it reminded him of how deep their bond had grown, how fragile love could feel, and how powerful it truly was. That spring, Richard received an invitation to speak at Columbia, his alma mater. He was to be honored for his philanthropic work and contributions to the tech world. He nearly declined. He hated the spotlight now. But when Caleb saw the letter and asked, Are you going to wear a suit and give one of those big speeches? Richard smiled and said, Only if you come with me. The night of the event, Caleb wore a little navy blazer and clip-on tie. He held Richard's hand the entire time. When it was his turn to speak, Richard stood before the crowd, cleared his throat, and looked down at the boy in the front row. I used to think success was measured in numbers, profits, expansions, features deployed. But these days, I measure my success by something much smaller. He paused. Like a paper crown at dinner, or a question whispered at night. He told them about Caleb, about Emma, about what it meant to be lost, and then found again, by someone you didn't even know you were looking for. There was no applause at first, just silence. Then, slowly, the room rose to its feet. Later that evening, Caleb looked up at him in the car and said, Mommy would have liked your speech. Richard smiled. I hope so. You talked like a dad, Caleb added. Not a boss. Richard turned to him. That's the best compliment I've ever gotten. Spring bled gently into summer, and with it came the kind of ease Richard never thought he'd earn again. A season where silence no longer meant loneliness, and where routine felt like peace rather than a prison. But peace has a way of testing its foundation. One Friday afternoon, Richard received a call from the shelter. It wasn't from Sarah, but from one of the new coordinators. Her tone was hesitant. There's a man asking questions about Caleb. Richard stood from his desk immediately. What kind of questions? He says he's a distant relative of Emma. We can't verify anything, but he knew her maiden name and her past job at the university. He left before we could press for ID. Richard's jaw clenched. Did he leave a name? No, just said he might come back. After the call, Richard sat in silence. It had been nearly a year since Caleb had come into his life. Everything they built, trust, safety, belonging, now felt suddenly vulnerable. That night, Richard didn't mention the call to Caleb. But he did something he hadn't done in months. He checked every lock on the doors twice, He stood by Caleb's bedroom longer than usual, and when he finally went to bed, his mind stayed awake long after his body had given in. The next day he called Margaret Monroe, Emma's aunt. "Have you heard anything? Anyone from Emma's past trying to contact you?" She paused. "No, but she used to get strange letters. Before she passed. From a man named James Carlton." Richard froze. "She never told me much," Margaret added. "Only that she once dated him. Briefly. Before you." Richard searched the name that night. James Carlton had a record. Nothing serious, just petty thefts and trespassing. But enough to raise concern. Enough to make Emma hide. He called his security advisor the next morning. "I want someone watching the shelter for a few days. Discreetly." And then, because he couldn't focus, he picked Caleb up early from school. They got ice cream, went to a bookstore, laughed too loud in a quiet park. It was all a distraction. Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was coming. That weekend, Caleb asked a question that caught him off guard. "Do I have any other family?" Richard hesitated. "Why do you ask?" Caleb shrugged. "We talked about it in class, making family trees, and I don't really know mine." Richard sat beside him on the couch. "You know me, and you know Aunt Margaret. That's a start. But was there anyone else? Like a grandpa?" The image of James Carlton crossed Richard's mind like a shadow. "There might have been," Richard said carefully. "But not everyone in our family is someone we need to know." Caleb looked confused. "What do you mean?" "It means some people are in our lives to teach us something, and some people stay. You're allowed to choose who your real family is." Caleb leaned against him. "Then I choose you." The words hit Richard like a wave, and just like that he knew, whatever came next, he wouldn't let the past break what they had built. The tension didn't explode right away, but something was coming. Richard could feel it. He began locking up earlier, walking Caleb to school himself, even canceling a business trip he'd been planning for weeks. The new stability they'd fought so hard for began to carry an invisible weight. Not from fear, but from love, because once you've truly found someone, the cost of losing them becomes unbearable. It was a Tuesday when it happened. The day had started like any other. School drop-off, a few Zoom calls, lunch at the corner cafe. Richard was halfway through reviewing an investor proposal when his phone rang. The shelter. Again. But this time, it wasn't calm. "Mr. Hayes, it's Marissa. Caleb's school just called us. He never showed up after recess. They've searched the building. He's not there." The room spun. Richard bolted from his chair, grabbing his coat with one hand and his keys with the other. "Has anyone checked the nearby streets? Cameras? Security?" "They're on it, but the school isn't equipped for lockdown protocols. He was last seen near the West Playground 10 minutes before they noticed he was gone." Richard was already out the door, running toward the elevator. He called the school directly, then his security advisor, then the police. By the time he reached the campus, squad cars were already pulling up. Teachers with pale faces huddled at the front gate. One of them pointed toward the security office, where footage was being reviewed. The screen showed a man, gray hoodie, faded jeans, kneeling behind a tree on the edge of the field. At recess, Caleb wandered too close. The man stepped out, said something. Caleb hesitated, then followed him out of frame. Richard felt his heart drop into his stomach. James Carlton. It had to be him. He showed the officers the folder he'd kept from his search, the records, the name, the warnings. "He knew Emma," Richard said through clenched teeth. "She tried to hide from him. He's after Caleb now." They issued an Amber Alert within the hour. Richard refused to sit down. Every second felt like failure. He went home only long enough to grab the music box Caleb loved, thinking maybe, just maybe, it would help jog someone's memory if they saw the boy. At 7:43 p.m., the breakthrough came. A cab driver saw the alert on his phone and recognized the boy in the back seat just 2 hours earlier. The man had asked to be dropped off near an abandoned rail yard outside Yonkers. Police mobilized. Richard insisted on going with them. "You're not authorized," the officer said. "I'm his father," Richard replied. "Try to stop me." They didn't. By the time they reached the site, darkness had swallowed the rail yard. Old freight cars lined the tracks like rusted ghosts. Flashlights swept through the corridors of collapsed fencing and overgrown brush. Then, movement. A cry. "Help!" Richard broke into a sprint before anyone could hold him back. He turned a corner and saw a metal shed at the far edge of the yard. The door was cracked open. He burst through. Inside, Caleb was curled up on the floor, eyes wide with fear, cheeks stained with tears. James stood over him, muttering to himself, holding a metal rod in his shaking hands. "She kept him from me. I had a right." "James," Richard said, his voice low and cold, "step away from him." James turned, startled. You took everything." "I'm not here for a fight. I'm here for my son." James's grip tightened. Caleb whimpered. Richard took one step forward. "He doesn't know you. You're a shadow from someone else's pain. But I know what he means to me. I know what she wanted for him." "Lee," James's eyes flickered. Uncertainty, exhaustion, madness. "Emma didn't want you in his life," Richard said, firmer now. "She didn't even want you in hers." James shouted, rage exploding from somewhere deep. But in that moment the police burst through the door behind Richard. They tackled him to the ground in seconds. Richard rushed to Caleb, scooping him up in his arms. The boy clung to him, sobbing. "You found me," Caleb whispered. "Always," Richard breathed. "I'll always find you." They didn't go home that night. Richard took Caleb to a safe house provided by the department. But in that small, unfamiliar room, with nothing but their shared heartbeat to ground them, they found peace. Later, Caleb asked, "Is he gone?" "Yes," Richard said. "And he can't hurt you." The boy was quiet for a moment. "I was scared." "So was I." Caleb looked up. "But I knew you'd come." Richard held him tighter. He had built companies, weathered loss, survived betrayal, but nothing had ever demanded more from him than this one truth. Being a father meant showing up no matter what. And that night, more than ever, he proved it. Months passed. The trial against James Carlton was quiet but definitive. Richard testified, as did the school staff, the cab driver, and even a psychologist who had evaluated James's state of mind. The man would serve time, not just for the attempted abduction, but for a pattern of behavior that stretched years into Emma's past. But for Richard and Caleb, the real story wasn't about courtrooms or verdicts. It was about what came after. They moved out of the penthouse, not for fear, but for freedom. Richard bought a modest brownstone on a quieter street in Brooklyn. 3 stories, a small garden, creaky wood floors that echoed with laughter instead of loneliness. Caleb helped decorate his new bedroom. Blue walls, glow-in-the-dark stars, a corkboard for his drawings. In the living room, they framed one of Emma's old photos. Emma holding baby Caleb, both half blurred but smiling like they were caught in a secret. Underneath it, Richard placed a brass plaque, "For the love that found us." Life became a rhythm neither of them had ever known. Weekend pancakes, burnt, but with syrup, movie nights with blankets and popcorn, homework spread across the kitchen table. Richard returned to work, but on his own terms. Half days, a tighter team, more focus, less noise. He launched a foundation in Emma's name, dedicated to supporting shelters like the one that had raised Caleb. Not just donations, but mentoring, structure, safety. He visited often. So did Caleb. One morning, as they left the shelter after reading to a group of younger kids, Caleb slipped his hand into Richard's. "You know what I think?" "What's that?" "I think Mommy picked you." Richard smiled, eyes stinging. "I think she did too." They walked the rest of the way in silence, but it wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of meaning, of a quiet kind of joy. A joy born not from perfection, but from choice, from staying, from fighting, from love that demanded more than comfort. It demanded courage, and that was the legacy Emma left behind. Not just a child, but a family. Years later, on the anniversary of Emma's passing, Caleb stood beside Richard at her grave, now taller, older, and steadier. He placed a small paper airplane on the headstone. "She'd have loved this one," he said. Richard nodded, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. "She'd have loved you." They stood in silence for a moment, then turned to leave. As they walked away, Caleb looked up with a small smile. "Hey, can I drive us home this time?" Richard laughed. "Not until you're 16, but he handed him the keys anyway, just for the feeling, and Caleb held on tight. If this story moved you in any way, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. We'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below sharing where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And tell us, what was the most powerful moment in this story for you? Your voice helps keep stories like this alive, and we read every comment. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. See you in the next story.